The Pacific has a sound when it breathes. It's the low hiss of wind over endless water, the kind of sound that feels older than language. And on one morning in 1982, that sound carried a whisper the modern world had long forgotten. The sound of a propeller cutting air like a heartbeat. Lieutenant Commander Jack Reynolds stood on the deck of the USS Ranger, arms crossed, squinting at the horizon. Behind him, the roar of two F-14 Tomcats filled the dawn. Their engines burned blue and loud, mechanical thunder built for a new age. The pilots joked that no ghost of history could touch them, not in speed, not in power, not in pride. But the Navy had other plans. They called it Operation Echo Pacific, a classified flight exercise designed for propaganda and nostalgia. A friendly duel, they said, between the F-14 Tomcat, America's symbol of modern supremacy, and a fully restored Japanese Zero fighter, one of the few that still flew. The event was to be filmed, narrated, and broadcast as a living lesson how far technology had come since the Pacific War. It wasn't supposed to be a contest. It was supposed to be a victory lap. Reynolds looked down at the brief in his hands. The Zero's pilot was listed simply as consultant, civilian. No rank, no history, no photo. He frowned. Who's this guy supposed to be? The flight officer shrugged. Some old Japanese test pilot. Flew in air shows. The brass thought it'd look good on film. Reynolds smirked. Sure, let's give Grandpa a history lesson. An hour later, both aircraft were airborne over the Pacific, one roaring with afterburners, the other humming with a low, haunting song that seemed to come from another world. The F-14 streaked ahead, wings swept back, a predator born of metal and mathematics. Behind it, the Zero glided through sunlight as if the sky itself wanted to carry it. Ghost 1, this is Tomcat Leader, Reynolds said over comms. You still with me? A voice answered. Calm, almost amused. Still here, Commander. The sky is the same as it was. Reynolds chuckled. We'll see about that. Control confirmed the start of the mock engagement. Rules of engagement, visual range only, guns, camera on, no missiles. Begin exercise at your discretion. Reynolds pushed the throttle forward. Copy that. Let's see how the past holds up. The F-14 accelerated to Mach 1. The ocean below blurred into streaks of blue and white. Through his HUD, Reynolds saw the dot behind him shrink to nothing. He's gone, he said, laughing. History can't keep up. But history wasn't behind him anymore. Contact 6 o'clock. His RIO, Lieutenant Harris, shouted. Reynolds snapped his head back. The Zero was right there, less than 100 feet off their tail, weaving through their wake like a shadow that refused to die. How the hell? Reynolds banked hard left. He doesn't have radar. How's he on us? Harris stared at the rear scope. He's reading our moves, like he knows them before we make them. Reynolds gritted his teeth. Fine, let's climb. The Tomcat roared upward, twin engines screaming against gravity. The Zero followed, its propeller flashing in the light, matching every movement like it had already lived this fight before. The two aircraft spiraled together, jet and relic, predator and ghost, until the clouds swallowed them whole. Talk to me, Ghost One, Reynolds said through the strain of G-forces. You sure you're not running on witchcraft? The voice came back soft and steady. You can't fight the wind, Commander. You can only learn to move with it. Reynolds rolled inverted, diving toward the ocean in a maneuver that had broken countless trainees. The F-14's wings locked forward automatically, shifting into low-speed configuration as he dropped below 5,000 feet. Let's see that antique pull this one off. But the Zero didn't just follow. It danced. The old fighter rolled into a perfect loop behind the Tomcat, positioning itself under Reynolds' blind spot. Its propeller wash rippled across the ocean like a phantom's breath. He's on us again, Harris yelled. Reynolds couldn't believe it. Impossible! He can't keep this angle. Then he's not keeping it, Harris said quietly. He's predicting it. Reynolds pulled a high G brake turn that nearly blacked him out. The Tomcat strained under the stress, metal shrieking as if it knew the past had claws. But the Zero was still there, its small frame cutting the air with surgical precision, its every move perfect not because of machinery, but because of something no computer could measure. Instinct. The comms crackled again. "The air remembers every pilot who respects it, Commander. Maybe you've been too busy conquering it to listen." Reynolds bit his lip. "Who the hell are you?" The voice paused. Then came a whisper. "Just another ghost from a war that never ended." Before Reynolds could respond, the Zero pulled ahead, slicing across his nose in a blur of silver and sunlight. The HUD screamed as his targeting system lost lock. "Jesus Christ," Harris muttered. "He's flying inside our envelope." Reynolds' frustration turned to awe. That's not possible. And yet, there it was. The impossible, alive and effortless carving patterns across the Pacific that no manual had ever written. The Zero wasn't outgunned. It wasn't outdated. It was free. For 3 minutes they danced, jet and prop, youth and memory, arrogance and grace. And when it ended, Reynolds didn't know who had won. He only knew that he'd been humbled. Control called over comms, voices echoing with disbelief. Exercise complete. Both aircraft returned to base. Repeat, return to base. Reynolds exhaled. "Roger." The Zero's voice came one last time, carried through static. "You fly with fire, Commander, but you forgot the wind." And then it was gone. Back on the carrier, reporters crowded Reynolds with questions. "Commander, how did it feel to face the legend of the Pacific? Did the Tomcat prove its superiority?" He took off his helmet slowly. The sea wind hit his face. "Superiority," he said quietly. "No, just balance." That night, under a sky full of stars, Reynolds stood alone on the deck. Far in the distance, lightning flickered over the horizon. For a moment he thought he saw something move in the flash. A small silhouette, wings curved in eternal grace. The Zero was gone, but the sky somehow felt alive again. The debrief room aboard the USS Ranger felt colder than the steel holding it together. Jack Reynolds sat at the table with his helmet beside him, trying to make sense of a fight that should have been impossible. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing the room in a pale glow that made everything feel flat and distant. Harris sat beside him, flipping through telemetry pages that told a story neither of them recognized. Lines of numbers and angles filled the paper, yet none of it explained how a 70-year-old fighter had stayed glued to them like a predator. The door opened, and Commander Wexler stepped inside, followed by the ship's captain. Neither man looked angry. They looked concerned, and that unsettled Reynolds more than any reprimand. The captain placed a thin file on the table and stared at Reynolds with a weight that made the room shrink. He said the ship was talking, that half the crew believed they had seen something extraordinary, and the other half believed they had witnessed an embarrassment. Reynolds braced for the accusation, but it never came. Instead, Wexler slid a sheet across the table, showing the timeline of the engagement, 3 minutes and 19 seconds. And below it, one line that read, "Unidentified aircraft, A6M Zero, maneuver envelope. Anomalous." Reynolds pointed at the word like it was an insult. Wexler told him that was their problem. The numbers didn't make sense, because the fight didn't make sense. The captain leaned forward and asked Reynolds what he felt up there. Reynolds tried to give a technical answer, then stopped. He felt like he was flying against someone who already knew what he would do before he did it. Someone who wasn't following aerobatic theory, but memory. The captain nodded like he already suspected that. Wexler opened the folder and revealed a photograph of the Zero sitting quietly on the mainland airfield where it was stored. Reynolds stared at the image. It looked like a museum piece, yet it had flown with a precision he had never experienced. The captain told him the paperwork listed the pilot as a civilian consultant. No rank, no verified combat record, no service files in any NATO database. Harris asked who actually spoke on the radio. Wexler hesitated before admitting something Reynolds didn't want to hear. The man who landed the Zero after the exercise wasn't the same one who took off in it. The real pilot had disappeared. The aircraft returned with someone much younger, someone who couldn't answer their questions. Reynolds argued. He insisted he had heard the pilot speaking calmly the entire engagement. Wexler replied that their recordings contradicted him. The audio during the fight was nothing but static. Reynolds slammed his hand on the table, refusing to accept that. Harris backed him up, repeating that they both heard the same voice. But the machines didn't. The captain finally said what none of them wanted to admit. They had no idea who Reynolds fought, and they needed answers before anyone outside the room started asking dangerous questions. The next morning, Reynolds and Harris were flown to the airfield where the Zero was kept. The place was small, old and quiet. A single Zero rested outside a hangar, its paint faded but its posture somehow alive. A mechanic named Maury greeted them with a bow. Reynolds asked the question that had been burning in him since the engagement. Who flew the Zero? Maury answered only that the pilot was a guest and that he was gone. Reynolds pressed harder, telling Maury he had held a voice in his headset that felt like it belonged to someone who had fought real battles. Maury did not deny it. He simply asked Reynolds whether he believed what the official story said. Reynolds didn't answer. His silence was the answer. Maury then invited them inside the hangar. Old photographs lined the walls, showing Japanese pilots from a different century. Some smiling, some solemn, all frozen in time. Maury pulled out flight logbooks, written in neat, delicate handwriting. They belonged to Captain Hiroshi Sato, a veteran of the Pacific War. Sato had survived when many of his squadron had not. After the war, he locked away his memories until the restored Zero arrived. Then he returned, not as a relic, but as someone who still belonged to the air. Reynolds read one entry. It said the sky had not changed even though the machines had, that the wind still rewarded respect and punished arrogance. Maury told them Sato died peacefully 3 years earlier. Reynolds felt the world tilt. Harris asked who flew yesterday. Maury answered by asking whether they truly believed the only pilots in the sky were the ones still alive to sign paperwork. Reynolds felt the chill roll down his spine. Maury then played an old cassette recording of Sato speaking during a historical interview. The voice that filled the hangar was the same voice Reynolds heard in the cockpit. Calm, wise, patient. The voice of someone who had flown enough battles to understand war at a level beyond tactics. The recording ended. Harris looked shaken. Reynolds looked pale. Maury said their aircraft recorded nothing but static during the engagement. Maybe machines could not understand certain frequencies. Maybe the sky chose what to reveal. Reynolds walked toward the Zero. He placed his hand on its wing. It was warm, warmer than metal should be. When he pulled his hand away, the warmth faded, but the feeling did not. Harris asked if he was all right. Reynolds said yes, though he knew nothing was all right. As they walked away, the Zero sat quietly with its nose pointed toward the horizon. Moments later, when no one was looking, its propeller shifted the slightest degree, as if aligning itself with the wind. The weather report would later claim there had been no wind at all, but the Zero, and whatever still flew within it, knew better. The flight back to the USS Ranger felt longer than it should have. Reynolds sat strapped into the helicopter seat staring at the ocean below, but his mind was still in that hangar, still hearing Sato's voice from a cassette recorded decades ago, still feeling the warmth of metal that should have been cold. Harris sat across from him, glancing up every now and then as if checking whether Reynolds was still the same man who had flown the Tomcat into that impossible dance. Neither of them spoke. When the helicopter touched down and the rotor wash faded, the deck felt different. It wasn't the ship that had changed, it was them. They walked into the ready room where the aircrew was waiting. Conversations stopped. Eyes followed Reynolds with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The footage from the engagement had already circulated, the Zero appearing where it shouldn't, turning in ways it shouldn't, tracking the Tomcat with an intuition that felt like a hand pressing gently on the future. Wexler approached with a tense expression and asked for a private briefing. Reynolds followed him into the operations office, where the captain was already standing with arms crossed. The room smelled of brewed coffee left too long on a burner. The captain asked what they found in Japan. Reynolds didn't lie. He told them about Mori, the logs, the cassette, the name Sato, the pilot who died years ago, and the voice that matched the one in his headset. The captain didn't interrupt. He listened with a stillness that suggested he was trying to measure how much of this could be contained and how much would escape no matter what he did. When Reynolds finished, the captain sighed and rubbed his temple. He said the situation had reached high command faster than they liked. A Pentagon representative was already en route. They wanted answers about the Zero, about Sato, about how a Tomcat had been outmaneuvered by a relic. Reynolds bristled at the implication. He insisted no one had outmaneuvered him using the Zero's capabilities alone. The man flying it had done something else entirely. Something he couldn't explain. Something that didn't fit in manuals. The captain asked what he meant. Reynolds hesitated, then said that the Zero didn't fly like a machine. It flew like a memory, wearing the shape of an aircraft. The captain didn't laugh. He didn't dismiss him. He simply asked whether the experience had compromised Reynolds' judgment. Reynolds replied that his judgment remained intact, but his assumptions had changed. The captain said that made two of them. That night, Reynolds lay awake in his quarters, listening to the distant thrum of engines vibrating through the hull. The sea outside was calm, but his thoughts were not. He kept replaying the moment when the Zero appeared behind him, not with force, but with inevitability. It had felt like someone stepping into a conversation they had already been part of. The next morning, the Pentagon representative arrived by helicopter. His name was Keegan, a man with a rigid posture and an expression trained to reveal nothing. He gathered Reynolds, Harris, Wexler, and the captain into the operations room. Without introduction, he began showing satellite images, radar anomalies, and classified reports. Lines traced across the Pacific, where unidentified aircraft had been seen or sensed over the past decade. Most were dismissed as civilian planes or atmospheric distortions, but a few lines matched patterns that made Reynolds' stomach twist. Keegan explained that for years they had collected sporadic reports of a small aircraft appearing briefly at dawn or dusk. Too fast for a prop plane, too slow for a jet, always vanishing before interceptors arrived. Reynolds asked why he was only hearing about this now. Keegan replied that intelligence agencies share information on a need-to-know basis, and until now, no one had gotten close enough to provide usable confirmation. Reynolds said he didn't confirm anything. Keegan disagreed. He said Reynolds confirmed that the aircraft wasn't a hallucination, wasn't a malfunction, and wasn't an illusion. It behaved with intent. And something with intent needed to be understood before the wrong nations drew the wrong conclusions. Reynolds felt the weight of that implication. The captain asked if Keegan thought the Zero was some kind of modern copy or prototype. Keegan said no modern aircraft behaved like that, not even experimental ones. The turns were too clean, the energy retention too natural, the timing too human. He said some in intelligence believed the aircraft was being flown by someone with experience older than any data model could process. Someone trained in a period when airplanes weren't instruments, but extensions of instinct. Reynolds asked if Keegan believed Sato was alive. Keegan said that wasn't his concern. His concern was that something in the Pacific knew how to defeat one of the best air superiority fighters in the world without modern tools. The room fell silent. Reynolds asked what Keegan wanted from him. Keegan said he was here to assess whether Reynolds was compromised, psychologically, operationally, or emotionally, before the story leaked to the wrong people. Reynolds clenched his jaw. He said he wasn't compromised. He said what he saw was real, and pretending it wasn't wouldn't make it go away. Keegan studied him for a long moment and finally nodded. He said Reynolds would fly again. Harris too. Not for show, but for analysis. They would reenact the engagement under controlled conditions. They would fly the same profile, same altitude, same approach. And if the Zero reappeared, they would capture every second of it. Reynolds asked what happened if the Zero didn't show. Keegan said then they would classify the event as an anomaly caused by environmental interference and close the investigation. Reynolds didn't like the cold certainty in Keegan's voice. Later that day, Reynolds and Harris prepared the Tomcat for the reenactment. As the crew checked the aircraft, Reynolds noticed something strange. The wind had shifted, blowing lightly across the deck, but the Tomcat's nose seemed angled just a few degrees off what he expected, as if the aircraft itself were listening to something beyond the metal. Harris asked if he was all right. Reynolds said he was fine, but inside he felt the same pressure he had felt just before the engagement, an invisible weight in the air, a tension vibrating through the deck plates. They took off at 1600 hours. The ocean stretched to infinity beneath them, its surface turning gold under the lowering sun. They followed the flight plan exactly. When they reached the designated altitude and bearing, Harris activated the enhanced telemetry systems. Everything looked normal, too normal. Reynolds found himself scanning the horizon obsessively. He didn't know what he expected to see. A glint of metal, a shadow crossing the sun, a shape rising from the ocean like a memory made solid. Minutes passed. Nothing. Harris said maybe the Zero wouldn't come. Reynolds didn't answer. He could feel something, some current in the air shifting, some pattern invisible to sensors. He banked slightly, adjusting their line. Harris asked what he was doing. Reynolds said he didn't know, but there was something in the wind, an old rhythm, a pressure change, the signature of presence. Then Harris saw it too. A blip on the passive sensor. Small, slow, steady. Reynolds looked up and saw the faint outline of a shape emerging from the dying sunlight. It wasn't rushing toward them. It wasn't intercepting. It was simply there, as if it had been there the whole time and only just decided to reveal itself. Reynolds tightened his grip on the stick. Harris whispered, "It's him." The Zero banked once, graceful and deliberate like a bow. Reynolds swallowed. He keyed his mic. He said he didn't know who was in that cockpit, didn't know what laws of aerodynamics they thought they were obeying, didn't know how a machine that belonged in a museum could command the air like a predator. But he said he was ready. The voice that answered wasn't static this time. It wasn't broken. It was calm, clear, and steady. It said, "Then listen to the wind, Commander. It has waited for you." And with that, the Zero rolled into the first turn of a dance that should not have been possible, leaving Reynolds with the unmistakable realization that he hadn't returned to analyze the past. He had returned to face it. The moment the Zero slipped into its first turn, the entire reenactment mission changed from analysis to survival. Reynolds felt the pressure build against the Tomcat's frame as he pushed into a countermaneuver. But the aircraft reacted with the heaviness of something built for speed, not intimacy. The Zero, on the other hand, moved with the quiet confidence of a creature that had lived inside the wind long before jets tried to conquer it. Harris called out angles and distances, but the numbers didn't help. The Zero wasn't fighting by numbers, it was fighting by feel. Reynolds pulled the Tomcat into a tightening circle, trying to use his superior thrust to widen the gap. But the Zero anticipated the move, cutting across the arc with a motion that shouldn't have been physically possible for a plane of its age and design. Reynolds felt the first drop of doubt settle in his chest. This was something watching him, measuring him, judging whether he had learned anything since their last encounter. The comms crackled again, not with static but with that same steady voice. It told him that speed meant nothing without purpose, and that power without patience was just noise. Reynolds wanted to argue, wanted to yell that they were flying a fourth-generation fighter with avionics light years ahead of anything from World War II, but he couldn't form the words. The Zero sliced underneath them, climbing into their blind spot. The Tomcat strained, metal groaning as Reynolds pushed it into a sharp brake turn. The G's clawed at his ribs. His vision thinned at the edges. But the Zero stayed with them, its silhouette flickering through the sun like a memory refusing to fade. Harris finally got a lock. Reynolds rolled the Tomcat inverted, diving back toward the ocean. Salt spray filled the canopy view as they skimmed low over the water. The Tomcat's engines thundered. For a moment, it looked like they had shaken the Zero. Reynolds checked the mirrored reflection on the water and saw the shape descending behind them, small and impossibly precise. It held perfect distance, like a teacher following a student who didn't quite understand the lesson. Reynolds wanted to force the Zero into a stall. He pitched upward, climbing sharply. Instead, it pivoted on its axis, turning through the climb in a maneuver that seemed to ignore the limitations of propeller aircraft. Harris shouted that it was impossible. He felt the frustration burning in his chest, the same frustration that had sparked during their first encounter. He had always believed that modern jets represented mastery, that they stood as proof that humanity had outgrown the fragile machines of the past. But the Zero reminded him of a truth he'd never considered. Mastery was not found in metal, but in the hands that guided it. The Zero slipped into position again. Harris tried to compute the angle of attack, but the figures didn't make sense. The aircraft wasn't fighting like any known blueprint. He knew he needed to stop fighting with force and start fighting with intuition. The Zero climbed alongside them, its wingtip glinting with sunlight. Reynolds keyed his mic. The voice answered that the pilot was only a messenger, nothing more. Reynolds insisted that he wanted the truth. The voice replied that truth was in the wind, and the wind belonged to all who listened. Reynolds felt a shift then, not in the aircraft, but in himself. He realized the Zero wasn't reenacting a battle. The Zero pulled upward, inviting the Tomcat to follow. He eased off the throttle, letting the Tomcat flow into the climb rather than force it. He felt the aircraft relax, felt the frame settle, felt the controls lighten. He said the readings looked cleaner than before, like the Tomcat was working with the air instead of against it. The Zero arced over into a loop. Reynolds mirrored the maneuver. The two aircraft moved in tandem, not as enemies but as dancers tracing the same invisible pattern that had existed long before either of them were born. For a moment, the sky quieted. Reynolds followed, letting instinct guide him instead of training. The two aircraft chased each other through the sky, not in combat but in communion, each move a question and an answer. Harris watched the instruments reflect something he had never seen before. The Tomcat's energy state flowed smoother. The AOA remained stable even in hard turns. It was as if the Tomcat had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. The Zero flattened out over the ocean. The voice returned, asking Reynolds what he saw. Reynolds said he saw a plane that shouldn't exist, doing things it shouldn't be able to do. The voice said that wasn't what it asked. He said he saw a pilot who understood the sky better than any manual taught. Still wrong. He stopped looking at the plane and started listening to the air around them. He felt a current, a shift, a rhythm. He said he saw the truth. The Zero wasn't fighting to win. It was fighting to teach. The voice responded with approval in a tone that felt like a nod. The Zero then began to climb again, but this time its movements were slower, gentler, as though its work was nearly complete. Harris asked what was happening. Reynolds said he didn't know, but he sensed something changing. The Zero reached the top of its climb and hovered for a moment against the sun. For a heartbeat, it looked like a silhouette trapped between two centuries. Then it rolled into a slow, graceful arc, descending in a glide that felt like farewell. Reynolds tried to follow, but the Tomcat's engines surged. The aircraft wanted to run, not glide. The Zero drifted away, slipping into a cloud bank. No contact. Reynolds banked through the clouds, scanning every corner of the sky. But the plane was gone. Harris said they should return to base. As they headed back toward the carrier, Reynolds realized something profound. He had not been defeated by the Zero. He had been invited to see the difference between flying with power and flying with purpose. When they landed, Keegan was waiting on the deck. Reynolds told him the Zero came. Reynolds said he didn't know. Reynolds hesitated. Keegan frowned and said that wasn't actionable intelligence. Reynolds replied that some truths weren't meant to be actionable. Some were meant to be understood. After the meeting, the captain walked with Reynolds to the edge of the deck. The ocean stretched out endlessly before them. The captain asked if the Zero felt hostile. Reynolds said no. He said sometimes the sky chooses strange messengers. They stood there in silence until the sun dipped low, and for a second Reynolds thought he saw a flash far out on the horizon, a glint of silver, but when he blinked it was gone. He asked if Reynolds believed the Zero would return. Reynolds said yes. Harris asked a reminder of what? A reminder that even the fastest jets in the world still fly through the same ancient sky as the men who came before them. A sky that remembers every hand that ever touched it. Harris considered that for a long moment. And the two men stood together, listening to the wind as the sun slipped beneath the ocean, as though the sky itself were whispering that their lesson was only beginning. 2 days passed without a sign, and yet the entire carrier felt as though it were holding its breath. The crew went about their routines, but there was an unspoken tension drifting between the steel walls, a whisper that something unseen was moving just beyond the edge of radar range. Reynolds felt it most when he walked across the flight deck at dawn. The wind had a different tone now, softer but heavier, like a presence waiting to be acknowledged. He tried to shake the feeling, but every instinct in him recognized the quiet before a storm, even if the storm this time didn't come from weather or war. The Pentagon representative, Keegan, became more intrusive with each hour. He demanded updates, interrogated technicians, and pored over footage that still showed nothing but the impossible. He questioned Reynolds repeatedly, asking what exactly made the Zero's presence feel different. Reynolds answered as honestly as he could. He said the Zero didn't fly like a relic. It flew like a memory wearing a body of metal. Keegan dismissed the analogy, insisting that data mattered more than impressions, but even he couldn't hide the flicker of unease forming behind his eyes. On the third evening, the captain called Reynolds to his quarters. The moment Reynolds stepped inside, he knew something was wrong. The captain's usually composed face was troubled. He held a folder containing newly received intelligence from Japan. According to the report, Mori, the mechanic who had shown Reynolds the logbooks, had been found unconscious in his hangar earlier that day. No wounds, no struggle, no explanation. He woke hours later confused, insisting he had heard footsteps and the sound of a propeller turning slowly in the dark, but the Zero hadn't moved, at least not visibly. Reynolds felt the unease tighten in his gut. He asked if Mori was all right. The captain said physically, yes, but his mind seemed shaken. Mori kept repeating the same sentence. The sky opened. The captain closed the folder and looked at Reynolds with quiet seriousness. He asked if Reynolds believed the Zero was still in Japan. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He remembered the warmth on the wing, the way the aircraft had moved on its own, the shifting propeller in the windless air. He finally said no. He didn't believe the Zero was anywhere humans expected it to be. That night, Reynolds returned to the deck again. The stars hung low over the ocean, reflecting faintly across the water. The ship cut through the dark like a silent blade. Harris joined him, standing at the railing. Neither spoke for a while. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was listening. Harris eventually asked whether Reynolds thought the Zero would return. Reynolds said he knew it would, not because the aircraft wanted combat, but because whatever guided it wasn't finished. Harris asked, finished with what? Reynolds didn't know, and that was the part that unsettled him most. The following morning, the entire ship was shaken awake. A klaxon blared across the speakers at 5:30. Pilots jogged through the passageways, pulling on flight suits. Officers shouted orders. Reynolds rushed to the flight deck where Wexler handed him a headset. Radar had picked up a small contact 2 miles off the starboard bow. No transponder, no formation, speeds inconsistent, altitude shifting, and then, just as quickly, it disappeared. But the ship wasn't imagining it. The radar sweep replay confirmed a signature, small, steady, sharp. Something had been there, something had looked at them. Keegan stormed onto the deck, demanding to know why an unidentified aircraft had approached a U.S. carrier group without interception. Wexler told him they hadn't had time to launch fighters. The contact came and went too fast. Keegan said the timing was not a coincidence. Reynolds agreed, because the timing matched the exact moment the sun broke the horizon, the same time the Zero had appeared during their first encounter. Dawn, the hour when shadows traveled between worlds. Reynolds requested immediate clearance to launch. Keegan protested, saying they needed to follow protocol. The captain overrode him. He said they were past protocol. They were in the realm of necessity. Minutes later, Reynolds and Harris were airborne in the Tomcat. The ocean gleamed beneath them. The sky burned gold. The wind hummed against the canopy with a tone that made Reynolds grip the stick tighter. He followed the bearing where the radar contact last appeared. Nothing but empty sky. He pushed farther. Harris scanned the horizon. Still nothing. Reynolds felt the frustration rising, but beneath it was something else. A sense that he wasn't alone. He keyed the mic and spoke into the radio, not expecting an answer. He said he didn't know who or what was flying the Zero, but he was here. He wasn't running. He wasn't afraid. The radio remained silent for a full 10 seconds. Then a voice returned, clear, calm, familiar. It said, "You listened." The Zero appeared beneath them, rising from the reflection of the sea as though it had been hiding inside the light itself. Reynolds felt a jolt of awe run through him. Harris swore softly under his breath. The Zero climbed steadily, not aggressive, not evasive, patient. Reynolds tightened his grip. He asked what the Zero wanted. The voice replied that humanity had forgotten something precious, something the sky had always offered, but had been drowned out by noise, by arrogance, by the illusion of control. Reynolds said he didn't understand. The voice said he would. The Zero banked left. Reynolds followed. They flew in tandem for nearly a mile until the Zero suddenly rose into a climb so steep it defied logic. Reynolds chased it, engines screaming. The Tomcat shook with the strain. Harris yelled that the angle was too much. Reynolds ignored him. They broke through a cloud layer. And there the Zero hovered in a patch of open sky, sunlight framing its wings. For a moment, it looked like time had split open. The voice said that machines evolve, but the sky does not. The sky has always spoken the same language, and only those who listened survived it. Reynolds said he wanted to understand. The voice said then he must do something no modern pilot wanted to do. He must stop fighting the sky and yield to it. The Zero began a maneuver Reynolds had never seen. Part loop, part drift, part surrender. It allowed gravity to lead instead of resisting it. It flowed. Reynolds tried to follow. The Tomcat groaned, but something astonishing happened. The jet softened, as if accepting guidance instead of forcing it. Harris watched the instruments glow with readings he had never witnessed in his life. The Tomcat moved not like a machine obeying commands, but like a creature discovering instinct. The Zero completed the maneuver with graceful ease. Reynolds matched it perfectly. For the first time, he felt something he had never felt as a fighter pilot: harmony. The voice spoke again. It said that victory in the sky was never about domination. It was about unity, of pilot, machine, and air. Reynolds whispered that he understood now. The Zero drifted back, its silhouette glowing against the rising sun. Then it said something that chilled Reynolds deeper than fear ever had. The sky has chosen you to remember. And then the Zero accelerated into a climb, so sudden it vanished into the light. Reynolds tried to follow, but the Tomcat refused. The engines choked, the stick stiffened. The aircraft vibrated violently as if rejecting something it wasn't meant to chase. Harris yelled for Reynolds to pull back. Reynolds did, leveling off as the Tomcat steadied, but the Zero was gone. They circled twice, 3 times, nothing, no signature, no glint, no sound. They returned to the carrier in silence. When they landed, Keegan demanded answers. Reynolds gave none, but the captain saw the truth in his eyes. Later that evening, Reynolds stood alone on the deck watching the sunset. The sky glowed with fading light, and the wind whispered across the steel. He closed his eyes. He listened. For the first time in his life, he heard the sky breathe, and he finally understood why the Zero had come. Not to challenge him, not to haunt him, but to teach him the one thing modern jets had forgotten. A pilot does not conquer the sky, a pilot joins it. For the next 48 hours, the USS Ranger felt less like a warship and more like a waiting room, suspended between 2 worlds. Jets launched, jets landed. Deck crews shouted, radios buzzed. But beneath the routine was a tension so sharp it seemed woven into the very wind. No one spoke openly about the Zero, yet everyone moved with the quiet awareness that something unseen was circling them just beyond the reach of instruments. Reynolds barely slept. When he closed his eyes, he kept replaying the moment the Zero rose from the ocean's reflection, the calm voice telling him he had been chosen to remember. It was not flattery. It was responsibility, and responsibility weighed heavier than fear. Keegan became increasingly agitated. He demanded constant updates, cross-referencing satellite data with carrier logs. Nothing matched. Nothing made sense. Every time he tried to pin down a pattern, the phenomenon dissolved like mist. He questioned Reynolds repeatedly, trying to force his experiences into a shape that fit the Pentagon's worldview. Reynolds refused to reduce what happened to jargon. He said the truth was simple. The Zero appeared when the sky allowed it, not when humans expected it. The captain supported Reynolds quietly, though he didn't say so directly. His calm presence became a shield between Reynolds and the tightening jaws of bureaucracy. He understood something Keegan did not, that some events were not meant to be controlled. They were meant to be witnessed. On the morning of the 3rd day, unusual atmospheric conditions formed around the carrier group. The sky grew strangely pale, almost metallic. The wind died until the air felt unnaturally still. Harris stood beside Reynolds on the deck and said the world felt like it was inhaling. Reynolds nodded. He felt it too. A pressure in the air, a shifting of something invisible. Then a call came from radar. A faint signal, weak, intermittent, no transponder, altitude erratic. Keegan rushed onto the deck demanding a scramble, but the captain was already giving the order. Reynolds and Harris ran toward the Tomcat, adrenaline surging like electricity through their veins. The launch was fast, almost frantic. Moments later, the Tomcat burst into the colorless sky. They climbed through a thin layer of haze until the ocean shrank beneath them. Harris scanned the forward scope, eyes sharp. The faint radar contact flickered in and out like a heartbeat. Reynolds pushed the Tomcat toward the source. The further they flew, the stranger the air felt. The controls seemed lighter, the sky seemed deeper, and the silence, an unnatural, heavy silence, settled around them like a shroud. Then Harris froze. He pointed through the canopy. Ahead, a shimmering distortion rippled in the air. Not light, not cloud, something else. A soft bending of space, wavering like heat above desert sand. Reynolds slowed, approaching the distortion with caution. The instruments began to flicker, and then the Zero emerged. Not abruptly, not dramatically. It simply drifted out of the distortion like a memory slipping into consciousness. Its wings reflected the dim light. Its propeller spun slowly, lazily, as if waking from a dream. Reynolds felt his breath catch. Harris whispered that nothing about this made sense. Reynolds keyed the mic. He called out to the Zero. The voice answered immediately, as though it had been waiting. It said the sky remembered every pilot who had ever respected it, and that some memories refused to die. Reynolds asked what the Zero was. The voice replied that it was not a machine. It was a story, carried forward by wind and will. The Zero climbed, inviting Reynolds to follow. He did. They rose through the haze, breaking into clear blue. The sunlight spilled across the Zero's wings, making the aircraft appear almost luminous. The voice told Reynolds that the world had changed too quickly, and pilots had forgotten the ancient conversation between man and sky. Reynolds asked why he had been chosen. The voice said because he listened, because he allowed the sky to teach him rather than trying to dominate it. Most pilots flew with pride. Reynolds flew with wonder, even when he did not admit it to himself. The Zero rolled into a long arc. Reynolds matched the motion. The two aircraft moved in harmony again, carving shapes into the sky that no radar could translate. Harris monitored the instruments. Everything remained stable, unnaturally stable. The Tomcat behaved better than it ever had, as if it understood the gravity of the moment. The Zero descended into a shallow dive. Reynolds followed until they skimmed just above the clouds. The voice spoke again, telling Reynolds that the Pacific had seen countless battles, countless lives, countless machines. But through it all, the sky remained unchanged. It held no allegiance to time, technology, or flag. It favored only truth. Reynolds said he wanted to understand the truth fully. The voice replied that truth was not learned, it was lived. The Zero pulled into a climb. Reynolds followed. They broke through a high cloud layer and emerged into blinding white light. The Zero slowed, hovering in a patch of stillness. Reynolds leveled out beside it. For the first time, the Zero felt close enough to touch. Reynolds stared at it, heart pounding. The paint was faded, the metal worn, but there was something unmistakably alive in its presence. A warmth that radiated through the air, a gravity older than the machine itself. The voice told Reynolds that every pilot left something behind in the sky. Some left fear, some left defiance, some left longing, but the greatest left memory. Captain Sato was one of those. His memory had not faded. It had found a vessel. Reynolds felt a sting in his chest. He asked what would happen now. The voice said the world was changing too fast. People raced ahead without listening. Pilots relied on machines instead of instinct. The sky needed someone who remembered the old ways, someone who would carry the message forward. Reynolds said he was only one man. The voice said that was all the sky ever needed. The Zero banked away. Reynolds followed until Harris warned of approaching fuel limits. Reynolds called out to the Zero, telling it to wait. The Zero slowed. It lingered, drifting just ahead of them. The voice said, this was not a farewell. It said lessons did not end. They continued as long as someone chose to listen. The Zero glided into a long descending turn. Reynolds couldn't follow without risking fuel depletion. He watched as the Zero dissolved into the pale haze, merging with the sky like a memory returning to its source. Radar reported nothing. The contact vanished. Everything returned to normal, too normal. Reynolds and Harris returned to the carrier. Keegan confronted them instantly, demanding data. Reynolds told him there was none. Keegan exploded with frustration. The captain ordered him to back down. He asked Reynolds what happened. Reynolds said the Zero came to remind them of humility. Keegan scoffed. Reynolds added that some truths could not be forced into reports. Later that night, Reynolds walked alone to the far edge of the deck. The wind moved differently now, brushing past him with a familiar cadence. He closed his eyes and felt the sky breathing. For the first time, he didn't feel like a pilot staring upward. He felt like part of something ancient, something endless. Harris found him there. He said he believed everything Reynolds had told him. He said he felt it too, the shift, the invitation, the presence. Reynolds nodded. They stood together, listening to the wind. Far on the horizon, lightning flickered. A single flash illuminated a familiar silhouette for the briefest instant, a small aircraft, wings glinting, and then it was gone. Reynolds didn't speak. Harris didn't ask, because both men understood something they could never fully explain. The Zero wasn't haunting them, it was guiding them, and the sky had only begun to reveal what it remembered. In the days that followed, life aboard the USS Ranger continued in motion, but not in spirit. The carrier launched aircraft, ran drills, logged flight hours. But beneath the routine was an unspoken understanding that something profound had brushed against them. Something that did not belong to any nation, doctrine, or era. The sky felt different. The air tasted different. Pilots walked the deck with a quietness that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with reverence. Even those who claimed not to believe in ghosts watched the horizon a little longer each evening, as if expecting a silhouette to materialize from the golden haze. Reynolds continued his duties, but his mind drifted constantly. He replayed every moment of the last encounter with the Zero, the strange harmony between two aircraft separated by half a century, the way the Tomcat had softened under his touch, as if remembering a grammar long forgotten. He felt changed, not in skill or confidence, but in perspective. He no longer looked at the sky as territory. He looked at it as a conversation. Keegan, on the other hand, grew more agitated. He pressed command for more missions, more data, more attempts to replicate the phenomenon. Every denial fueled his frustration. He cornered Reynolds in the ready room one afternoon, demanding answers he had no right to demand. Reynolds told him the truth, that some encounters were not meant to be reproduced. Keegan told him that sounded like superstition. Reynolds told him it sounded like respect. The tension between them simmered until Wexler intervened and ordered Keegan to back off. But Keegan wasn't done. Later that evening, he bypassed the captain and radioed the Pentagon directly, insisting the carrier group launch a full-scale sweep of the airspace where the Zero had appeared. The Pentagon refused, citing safety concerns. Keegan erupted in anger so explosive that the captain had him confined to quarters until the ship returned to port. The matter was quietly recorded as operational stress. Reynolds didn't feel triumphant. He felt pity. Keegan had witnessed the same phenomenon, but lacked the capacity to accept what didn't fit into a report. On the fifth night after the last encounter, the sky grew restless. A warm wind swept across the deck, even though the ocean was cool. The stars brightened unnaturally before fading behind thin, shifting clouds. Something was coming, not danger, but presence. Reynolds felt it deep in his chest like a second heartbeat. He walked to the edge of the deck, Harris joining him minutes later. The two stood side by side, both silent. They felt it before they saw it. The air thickened, the wind paused, and then the sound came, a low, distant hum that did not belong to any jet engine. It was the sound of a propeller slicing through the memory of the world. A shape emerged from the dark, first a glint, then a silhouette, then the unmistakable form of the Zero, drifting just above the horizon. It was not flying fast. It was not performing maneuvers. It was simply arriving, as though answering a call neither of them remembered making. Reynolds felt a pull inside him, an instinct older than training. He stepped forward until he reached the very edge of the deck. The Zero glided closer, its engine whispering with a sound that felt like the echo of an old language. Harris whispered that it was impossible, but his voice trembled with awe rather than denial. The Zero hovered parallel to the ship, its cockpit aligned with Reynolds, and then, through the canopy, he saw him, not clearly, not sharply, but enough. A face weathered by time, eyes that had seen war and peace, a presence more than a person. Captain Hiroshi Sato. The voice didn't come through the radio this time. It came through the wind itself, carried in a vibration that brushed against Reynolds's mind like a memory he had forgotten he owned. It told him that the sky had witnessed countless generations of pilots, each believing they were the masters of the air. But mastery had never belonged to metal. It belonged to connection. The Zero drifted forward, rising slightly. Reynolds felt an instinctive urge to reach out his hand, even though he knew the distance between them was far too great. But as he raised his arm, the wind around him shifted, warm and deliberate, like something responding. The Zero's wings glowed faintly in the moonlight. Then the voice told him that pilots were temporary, aircraft were temporary, but stories lived long after both returned to silence. And some stories chose their carriers. The Zero told Reynolds he had been chosen, not because he was the best, but because he was willing to listen. Reynolds felt his throat tighten. He asked, not with his voice, but with a thought, what he was meant to do. The answer came with the softness of a whisper: remember, teach, and guide those who believed the sky was something to be conquered rather than honored. The Zero began to ascend slowly. As it rose, its edges blurred, not like a plane fading into distance, but like a memory dissolving into the very air that carried it. The propeller slowed. The silhouette dimmed. Light passed through it as though it were becoming part of the sky itself. Harris squeezed Reynolds's shoulder, grounding him in the moment. Reynolds didn't look away. He watched until the Zero became nothing but a shimmer in the dark, nothing but an impression in the wind, nothing but a story sliding back into the silence that had birthed it. The sky exhaled. The wind returned to normal. The hum faded. Reynolds felt tears forming, quiet, unbidden. Harris didn't speak. He simply stood with him, letting the silence settle. The next morning, the captain called an all-hands briefing. He announced that the reenactment exercise had concluded and the carrier group would return to port. He gave no details. He answered no questions. He simply said, sometimes the ocean gave you answers you didn't know you needed, and sometimes it asked questions you didn't know how to answer. Reynolds understood. When they reached port, Reynolds received a private message from Mori in Japan. It contained no explanation, no warning, no request, only a single sentence. He flew well with you. Reynolds closed the message without replying. Some things didn't need responses. Over the years that followed, Reynolds continued flying. He became an instructor. Younger pilots admired him without fully understanding why. They said his flying felt different, that he treated the air like a partner instead of a battlefield. Reynolds didn't explain. He simply guided them into maneuvers the way the Zero had guided him, through instinct, through humility, through listening. Some nights, long after his students left the hangar, Reynolds would stand on the tarmac, staring at the horizon. Every so often in the hush just before dawn, he swore he heard a faint hum rolling across the sky, a soft vibration, the sound of a propeller turning where no aircraft should be. He never investigated. He never told anyone. He simply closed his eyes and listened, because he knew what the wind was saying. It was the same message the Zero had carried across generations, the same truth that outlived war, technology, and time. The sky remembers, and so would he.